how do you see this presentation as being relevant now? And do you see uncertainty as being the key issue?
That's a great question, Jay, and I'm glad you mentioned it because uncertainty is kind of the calling card that we placed for this presentation. But I think this presentation is really going to address very fundamental conditions, which are drivers for uncertainty, drivers for risk. And I think it's important that investors and all who incur international risk exposure become more aware of what these drivers are, these fundamental conditions or drivers. I don't think they receive the kind of attention that they should. And I think that traditional indicators of risk, whether it's valuation levels or rate spreads, offer, in a sense, an incomplete picture for risk takers, for investors, as they think about the global environment, which is inherently dynamic and changing and subject to catalyzing events that change the tenor or the pitch of the risk they're exposed to. So that's what motivated me to put together this presentation. And I guess with that, I will start. And it's very much a pleasure to do this presentation, estimating global uncertainty, critical caveats when searching for scarce returns in a low rate environment. I just want to say that just to cut to the chase, what I'm going to talk about is, again, as I mentioned in response to Jay's question, we're going to think about risk. We're going to think about an uncertainty, which the IMF has recently tried to draw a bead on as an attempt to really understand what's going on. What is the pitch or tempo of the current environment? And we're going to say, and we'll make the proposition that it's really the sources of uncertainty, the sources or conditions that underwrite risk, that generate uncertainty. Those are the things, those fundamental aspects of the environment, of the global environment, of the geopolitical environment, that risk takers need to become much more familiar with, need to actively take into consideration in their own due diligence processes. And we're going to talk about those four sort of concepts, conceptual delimiters of the global order. And the global order, just to summarize, is just the way in which nations of the world and people, agents in the world, are able to interact well, effectively, or not. And so those four underpinning conditions are the level of confidence, the extent of deterrence, the practice of transparency, and the evidence of reciprocity. So just going into the presentation, indeed, as I mentioned earlier, the International Monetary Fund has attempted to quantify uncertainty, and it's done so through effectively a text mining exercise where they derive an index that looks at a country's particular level of uncertainty as the IMF defines it, and also compiling those country uncertainty indices or index measures, they arrive at a global uncertainty index. So this is a way in which the IMF is trying to trying to draw a bead on uncertainty as a means of informing the global community, so to speak, that this environment, as we see it, as we experience, is manifesting very strong levels of uncertainty among investors and decision makers. And maybe then an environment with a lower overall calculated score shows current certainty, so to speak, or current confidence levels being much more robust in the global environment. And obviously the IMF feels that there are good policy ramifications and consequences for trying to derive or ascertain the level of uncertainty. And again, they use a text mining process. This PowerPoint deck will be available to listeners and participants who would like to see it and get more detail into what the IMF is doing. But just to move on a bit, the IMF has compiled an historical gauge of that uncertainty index calculation for the globe on a global basis. And of course, up until say the end of 2020, you can see the massive increase in uncertainty as the world was grappling in the middle of 2020 with the full-blown extent of the pandemic and a tapering off to some extent of uncertainty levels as vaccines and corrective measures that seem to have traction were being introduced into the global economy. And the thing about that IMF exercise is that's all well and good that they're able to do that, but taking a snapshot of uncertainty is really a stock exercise. But I think for investors and for people who are dynamically exposed to risk, where you have a position you're investing in, and the risk, so to speak, around that position will ebb and flow because conditions are dynamic, things change. Having a snapshot of uncertainty is not going to capture that flow characteristic. To capture that flow characteristic, you have to think about what are the sources of risk? What are the sources giving rise to uncertainty and giving rise to risk? So you have to think about the fundamentals, as it were. Just as one thinks about the fundamentals for looking at a company, how is it able to generate its revenue? What is its business model? Does that seem viable? Is it enacted and reified in practice? Just so you have to think about what are the sources, say, in the geopolitical order, the way the world works, the way participants in the world interact with each other. What are the sources that may give rise to uncertainty or a more certain environment? And so we think about four conditions. There are four conditions just to have a conceptual framework, just so someone can see and picture, well, this is how the world seems to be working well or not. These seem to be behaviors and conditions which are conducive to effective behavior or not. And we would posit that there are four really fundamental conditions to think about. They are confidence, the extent of global confidence, the presence of deterrence, how evident transparency is between actors in the global environment, and indeed, very important, the aspect of reciprocity. Are actions returned in good faith among agents and actors in the international environment? And so what I'm going to do is think about these four conditions, and just for the sake of stimulating due diligence interest, think about where there may be sort of breaks in the conceptual armor, so to speak, where there may be some vulnerabilities that risk takers should diligence in their overall assessment of the geopolitical environment, of where the geopolitical order is. And so in terms of confidence, the confidence that agents have that the system is working, what could enervate that confidence? What may be enervating that confidence? And one thing that may be enervating that confidence on a global basis might be leverage, because the COVID-19 pandemic phenomenon has led to a wholesale increase in global leverage levels. Now, just as trees can't really grow to the sky, nor can debt, certainly nor can debt grow to the sky with without reference to the actual productive capacity and earning capabilities of the underlying economy. And so the growth in debt, which has been very dramatic, is and may give risk takers pause over time. It is something that we think people should keep an eye on in terms of global leverage and its viability or absence of viability. As you can see here in this chart, public sector leverage for the United States has grown dramatically, especially with the onset and implementation of corrective measures vis-a-vis COVID. We would also note in sort of a twin-like fashion that monetary policy and accommodation has taken on entirely unprecedented levels, a trend that is seen its advent with the world economies and the US economy specifically, accommodation and management of the global financial crisis at the end of the first decade of the century, and now with a new unprecedented crisis, which was COVID-19. As you see here, the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve System is at a level that is utterly unprecedented. So if we think about deterrence, deterrence is very important because deterrence means that relative strengths are known and consequences of brinksmanship, belligerent action, or say aggressiveness are also known among all actors. So with that deterrence in effect, with consequences evident, that has a natural stabilizing effect in the global order. But now there is a small break, so to speak, in that abiding level of deterrence, which say the current global order with the United States as the benevolent hegemon, has maintained since the end of the Cold War period. Now we have a resumption, as it were, of great power rivalry. And that sort of casts a new look at the viability of deterrence, at least as it has been post the Cold War period. And on transparency, again, generally with the adoption of international standards of reporting and transparency, with that standardization being accepted by most nations participating in the global order and the global capital markets, one can say in many ways that transparency has probably been better than it ever has been. But I would argue that with the increase in capacities, in technical capacities, in new technologies, and new ways of doing things, and also with that, the greater changes in agency among the world's participants, among the nations, the countries of the world, sometimes transparency per se isn't keeping up. And sometimes new capacities, sometimes very formidable capacities, can be coming online without the accompanying transparency that most of us in the global community would like to see. And so we have an interesting example of an aberration, as it were, in terms of that general transparency ethos, and that is the implementation, say, in different countries of biosafety level 4 labs, which are the most state-of-the-art bioresearch labs online. And we have here, as this chart shows, some countries, notably, as it were, Gabon, Russia, and China, which are in possession of these biosafety level 4 labs, and which, according to the World Governance Indicators on Transparency, published and maintained by the World Bank, those three countries represent some of the very lowest levels of transparency. So we see sort of a crease or a weakness, a vulnerability in terms of the condition as it relates to international and global transparency, just as we've shown some vulnerability in terms of global confidence. And we'll now go to the next screen. And here, fundamentally, we think about reciprocity. Now, really, reciprocity is the proof in the pudding in terms of how the global order works. Because reciprocity is simply a return of a favor, as it were, an honoring of a commitment, and making good on a promise. That's really the lifeblood of the international order, and I would argue, for that matter, of civilization. If I make a promise, I keep it, and if you make a promise to me, you're going to keep it. Our actions reinforce each other. And so here, generally, in the globalized world environment, reciprocity has worked remarkably well, and it's burgeoned. It's burgeoned over these past decades as more of the world has become wealthier, more integrated, and technology has facilitated that process. But here, what's an interesting exception to that overall sort of trend in reciprocity is to think about, one in a sense, striking exception to it. And that is, if you think about just the simple situation of a national currency. And in this case, we think about the national currency issued in China, the renminbi. And, the interesting thing about it is when a person, any citizen holds a currency, that person holds it with the promise that it is a store of value and it's fungible, meaning it can be exchanged for something else of value, of comparable value. And yet, in the situation of China, there are currency holders who hold renminbi, presumably as a store of value, as a means of exchange, but the fungibility of that currency is remarkably abbreviated and abridged, thereby sort of violating that reciprocity, the understanding of residence, that a currency will be that store of value and will be fungible, and the aim of the sovereign authority to delimit its sovereign area, its sovereign influence through being able to issue such a promise and getting people to buy into that promise, to abide by that promise. And so we see that as residents in China have become aware, so to speak, of that broken promise, of that absent reciprocity, there is reaction. And in fact, we see, and we've witnessed over the past decade, that when capital controls were somewhat relaxed in China, there was a very much a kind of under-heralded balance of payments crisis, where the overall balance of payments in China went into dramatic deficit, and reserve levels in China quickly reduced as people exited from the economy as they could in order to buy assets that reflected the level of fungibility that they wanted. And of course, the Chinese authorities backed away from that relaxation, making capital account controls and strictures much more substantial to arrest that flight, that absence of confidence, with the recognition among, again, Chinese residents that the government is not necessarily making good on that promise of the store of value mechanism and the fungibility mechanism that any currency holder should expect. So just as I was saying earlier at the onset, our presentation, it's great to think about risk. It's great to think about uncertainty. It's great to be aware of where you think risk is at this point of time, where you think uncertainty is at this point of time, but reflect that many times the traditional windows onto risk, and for that matter, onto uncertainty, aren't delimited. They're snapshots. What you really have to take into account as a global risk taker, as a participant in the global economy, are sources of uncertainty, of sources of risk, of what is dynamically behind how global conditions may be evolving, how the global order is working. And again, think about how the global order works in terms of confidence, deterrence, transparency, and reciprocity, and shape your due diligence exercise accordingly, thinking about these four concepts. And as you build and develop your global portfolio of activities, whether it's investing in real assets or in tradable debt or equity securities, bear in mind where you think the global environment is, how fundamentally strong or weak you perceive it to be, and how you should risk hedge accordingly. Jay, it's over to you.
Oh, sure. With the insights that you just shared, can you extrapolate to the current event, and can you talk more about some of the conditions for geopolitical order? How, for example, has the current pullout from Afghanistan influenced geopolitical conditions?
That's a great question, and it's it's kind of indeed a timely question. I think that the way that the pullout situation was conducted in Afghanistan by U.S. forces, as directed by the Biden administration, was an attenuating action in terms of global deterrence. And I say that because it shows a lack of fluency and competence, maybe, in terms of how that process should have been executed. So I think, unfortunately, I think that deterrence, global deterrence, may have taken a little bit of a bump or a hit on or from the action of the somewhat ham-fisted pullout from Afghanistan done by U.S. forces. So it was definitely a negative development. Hopefully, it will not be too malignant, so to speak. Hopefully, it's going to be somewhat contained, meaning the U.S. assertion of its powers or of its deterrent, its ability to register deterrence will be robust, will be stronger going forward. But it was a negative development, quite frankly.
Okay, if we can pull your whole presentation together for our participants, how can investors use this kind of geopolitical framework to good effect? Can such an understanding foster compounding returns?
Ideally, indeed, yes. The due diligence exercise, as it's done in many respects, at the company level, at the global macro level, is obviously intended to foster returns. We're studying situations so we can better understand them, so we can take our risk positions accordingly in a more informed way to derive and to generate those returns we're seeking. So a better understanding of how the world's working, what are the conditions underlying either global stability or more uncertainty, more event risk, those are the things that you want to have a stronger understanding so that you can take, with a limited risk budget, the proper hedging steps and techniques that are going to preserve the integrity, so to speak, or the principal value of your portfolio. As you can do that, then you have a much better situation for fostering compounding returns, which is really the desideratum of every manager, where you are managing assets, whether they are hard physical assets somewhere or whether they're tradable assets, portfolio assets. When you're exposed in a negative way to the fell circumstances of fate, meaning a very, very powerful event risk manifestation, that compounding return process is certainly confounded. So you do want to know as much as you can, have as good an understanding as you can in terms of, say, the global environment. So those would-be black swans, so to speak, are gray swans. You're kind of aware in a better way of how the global environment is working and how you can have exposure, foster returns, and protect your principal so that your portfolio is growing substantially and significantly over time.